Hey, if you like Led Zeppelin, even if it's just a little bit, I think you'll enjoy what I have for you here today. So yesterday we went and saw Becoming Led Zeppelin. And it was a little bit of a commitment because we have to go down to Las Vegas to see it. It's not showing in St. George. St. George, Utah is where the studio is that we broadcast out of. So it's 2 hours down, movie with all the trailers and things, almost 3 hours, 2 hours back. So the first thing I need to say is, obviously, if you're a Led Zeppelin fan, you need to go see it. It's pretty cool. The footage, the sound, the stories, and part of what makes this cool is that the only talking in the movie is just the guys in the band. And, you know, like a lot of documentaries where they have, you know, this other rock star, this actor, somebody goes, yes, I really used to love, listen, there's none of that stuff. It's just the four guys telling their stories. And if you don't know much about what the story is it's being told, is it starts out kind of telling a little bit about all of their childhood, where they grew up, their formative years, and then basically tell the Led Zeppelin story through Led Zeppelin II, and then that's it. That's why Becoming Led Zeppelin, it just kind of gets you started with their career. And what I did here is I found a bunch of moments that for me really stood out as far as the storytelling goes. And these were things, because again, this was these guys actually telling their story. What I grabbed is just a bunch of like little things that they said throughout this documentary that stood out to me, that I thought were significant, either because they were just interesting, or they were kind of cool from a philosophical standpoint, or you know, telling a little bit about their life. Anyway, there's some really cool stuff in here that I want to share with you today. And when you listen to this stuff, if you've already seen the documentary, hopefully you'll kind of remember some of these things that were said. And if you haven't seen it yet, when you hear some of these things, you'll be able to look out for them when you go see it, because you need to go see it. And especially, like I said, if you're a fan of the band, it's just kind of cool to be able to go see this stuff, see this old footage, and experience that in a theater like this. So again, they start off with these guys kind of talking about their formative years. So the first thing that I thought was kind of neat was this. Jimmy Page was talking a little bit about when he first started hearing music coming from America. And he basically said he was listening to all of this, like this great rock and roll coming from America, and specifically the electric guitar. And he said, and this is the part I wrote down because I thought this was so cool. He said it was almost like it was coming from Mars, even though it was coming from Memphis. So one of the things that's so interesting about this time for me, because when Led Zeppelin was hitting, when this stuff came out, when they were having these experiences, I wasn't even born yet. And there's so many people that lived through this, that talk about this, that so many things were changing. And especially you had all these different groups that were over in England, all these people that were hearing all of this amazing music coming from the United States, that were blues standards. And then people over in England were basically repackaging them and then sending them back over to the United States. And when you look back at this and you go kind of year by year, you just see how many new sounds were happening, new approaches, new types of music, you know, the development of the electric guitar, so many things were changing. And so when I heard Jimmy Page say that, it was so cool listening to it, because this whole idea that he was hearing all this stuff, but it was such a time of change. And he kind of expressed that. It was like all this stuff that we're hearing, it seemed like it was coming from Mars, even though it was just coming from Memphis. Anyway, I loved that one. So the next thing, this was Robert Plant. And he was actually talking a little bit about when he was in school. And he didn't say anything about him being a bad student or even not liking school. As a matter of fact, he was even saying that school was fine and he didn't mind it and kind of liked everything that was going on in school. But then he talked about hearing and seeing Little Richard. And when he talked about this, it was pretty interesting, because he actually said specifically in this documentary, he said that it was hypnotic. That it was kind of, that it was provocative, that it was all consuming. And when he heard it, he said, I knew then that all I really wanted to do was sing. And then this is the part that I captured that I thought was so neat. He goes, that was it. The syringe was in the arm forever. I loved how he said that, because again, it was that moment of Little Richard. And in the documentary, they show some footage of Little Richard, and he was just such an amazing performer. And again, like even Robert Plant said, he was just hypnotic. And it was pretty interesting hearing him say that, because a lot of the footage that they show of Robert Plant in this documentary from the early part of the career of Led Zeppelin, he is pretty wild on stage. You know, the stuff that I remember when I was growing up, the first footage I ever saw of them in concert was The Song Remains the Same, and he's fairly tame in that. But you watch him during this period here of Led Zeppelin 1 and 2 and the footage that they made part of this documentary, and you kind of, at least I had kind of forgotten just how the energy that Robert Plant was putting into this stuff. And you can kind of see why, how Little Richard would have impacted him, because you look back at Little Richard and that guy was wild. Anyway, he was something. So that was another thing that was kind of cool. Okay, so this one was so awesome. So this is another thing that Robert Plant said that jumped out at me. And again, so these quotes, this stuff that I'm talking about right now, this is before Led Zeppelin's even formed. And they're, again, talking about kind of their formative years. And so Robert Plant wanted to be a singer, like we just talked about there. And he said in this documentary that was something that was so interesting. He said, I knew there were singers that had more chops than me. And then this is the part that really jumped out at me. I was just out there throwing it up in the air. And that was it's such an important thing to remember, not just as a rock star or whatever, but just like that's good life advice. You know, this recognition that's like, look, I'm not the best person in the world at this particular thing, but you show up. And it was just, I loved hearing him say this, because it was this humble recognition of, man, I just got to go work. I got to put the hours in. I got to put the time in. I got to put the effort in. And he recognizing there's a lot of people better than me, but I'm the one that's out there. I'm the one out there pushing it. I'm the one out trying to make a name for myself. And you know, you hear that thing that half of success, or maybe it's more than that, 80% is just showing up. And he talked about that fact here in this part of the documentary. Okay. So this one was so great. So then they're talking to John Paul Jones, and he's kind of starts reminiscing about what it was like when they first got the band together. And so you kind of know the story. Jimmy Page had joined the Yardbirds, and then the Yardbirds are falling apart, but they still have some dates that they need to fill. And then Jimmy Page wants to kind of build this new band, and he starts finding these players. And one of these guys is a guy that he's worked with in the studio, John Paul Jones. And then, of course, he gets Robert Plant and John Bonham. And then John Paul Jones talks about what it was like when he first got to hear Robert Plant, and I loved this. This was so awesome. And so this is John Paul Jones. He said, I'd never heard anything like it. I was expecting some cool soul singer, and there's just this screaming maniac with a fantastic voice and a fantastic range. That was such a cool thing, because can you imagine being John Paul Jones in that situation? Of course, these guys are, at this point, John Paul Jones and Jimmy Page are both kind of, even though they're very, very young, they're kind of studio veterans. I mean, they're spending all their time, you know, pro-level studio work, very, very well respected. They kind of know this type of music that they're going to be playing, which is very blues-oriented. And he comes in there, like he said, kind of expecting this good soul singer, and then he calls him a screaming maniac. Anyway, that was one of the great moments of this show. Okay, so now the band's together, and Robert Plant is talking a little bit about what it was like now to go, when they went off to go fill these Yardbird shows that I think they were in Scandinavia, that they had to go fill these prior obligations. And they were going there basically as the Yardbirds. And he talks a little bit about how he and John Bonham now are on this airplane together, and what that was like now. Because part of the thing to understand is Robert Plant, for all intents and purposes, is homeless. He wants to be a singer. That's in his blood. That's what he wants to do. And he doesn't have anything really big going on for him right now. And now, Terry Reid has suggested him to Jimmy Page. They've got the band together. It seems to be working out. And here is Robert Plant. He's got this gig, and now we're going to go play these Yardbird dates. And this moment, this thing that he said, and I tried to capture most of this, but this is pretty interesting. He says that he went on an airplane, and he talks about how he and John Bonham were sitting next to each other, and he said there was they're sitting there and they're being fed, and there's all this silverware, knives and forks in front of them. And then he said stuff that we would have normally stolen. it was there in profusion. And then he goes on and he says, and there was all these, here he was on this airplane, there's all these people being kind and charming. And then he even mentions and air conditioning. And then he says, and this is the part that jumped out to me that I thought was that was so important at this moment, of course, in the development of this band. And he's talking about this experience on the airplane and going to play these Yardbird gigs. And this is Robert Plant really kind of, for the first time doing something pretty kind of big, kind of serious. I mean, everybody knew who the Yardbirds were. They were a significant band. And so he said, as he's looking at this situation that he's in right now, surrounded by all these people and the airplane and all this, he goes, what could you do? You couldn't go back to mommy then. And again, this was all about this fact that he was on his own. He was kind of homeless, and he was trying to go make it for himself. And once he had tasted that, once he'd been in that moment, I've been on the airplane, I've been surrounded by this stuff, the silverware and the air conditioning and all these wonderful people. And it was kind of a we're not in Kansas anymore moment for him. And I again, as far as the development of Led Zeppelin for Robert Plant, that was this moment where things really changed for him. Okay, so now they keep going through the story, the record's out, and they talk about going over to play in the United States. And there was this really cool thing, because remember, this whole documentary is about, it's called Becoming Led Zeppelin. And there's these very subtle little moments in there. This is why you need to go see this and look for some of these things I'm talking about, because to me, these were the things that kind of emphasized what this was that made them who they were, and built that kind of closeness that they had. The closeness that led them so that when Bonham died in 1980, they were like, we can't do this anymore because it is just the four of us. And so this is one of them. So they're going on their first tour, and they said Denver was the first show. And this is Jimmy Page talking. And he says, there weren't that many people there. And he says, and I thought, oh boy. But then this is the part. He says that he told the other guys in the band, let's just group together as though we're playing in a club. And then he says, and then we'll just play to each other, and whether the place is half full or completely full, we're just going to play for ourselves. So that was, let's just group together as though we're playing in a club. And then he goes on and he says, let's just play for ourselves. And it was kind of a cool moment where he's realized, where you're looking around and you're going, we don't know where this is going to go. This might end up we may not even have a big crowd here, but somehow it's the four of us as a team. And okay. And so this is why it jumped out to me when he said it. Because I remember when I saw the movie Song Remains the Same, and one of the things that jumped out to me, because remember, all that stuff happened, I was too young. When this stuff came out, I wasn't even born. And when The Song Remains the Same was filmed, I was 2, 3 years old. I'm just this, and so I'm seeing this later in the 80s. And by the time I see this movie, I've already been to concerts like Journey. I think I'd probably seen Judas Priest at that point, and Def Leppard, and these big shows and these in these big arenas. And I remember when I saw Song Remains the Same, one of the things that jumped out at me was the intimacy of their show. Now that might be partly because back in the late 60s and early 70s, they didn't have these grandiose, massive productions quite the same way that, well, not even close to the same way we do today, or maybe even in the early 80s. But it struck me when I was watching Song Remains the Same for the first time, how they all kind of looked like they were almost huddled together. They're all right there next to each other. And so when I heard this particular thing in the documentary, let's just group together as though we're playing in a club. And it emphasized the closeness of what they were doing and what they were creating. And in some ways, the improvisation that they were known for, it allowed them to be able to do that effectively. Okay, so here's a couple more that were really fun. So then they go on and they start talking about, they go on this tour, and then they start talking about how the critics, and we've talked about this on this channel so many times, how the critics at the time, a lot of them just did not like what they were doing. And John Paul Jones specifically references the notorious Rolling Stone Led Zeppelin I review, where basically they just were like, nah. They were not kind to Led Zeppelin in that first review. And so John Paul Jones brings that up and he says, they did not like us. And so then Robert Plant, they cut to him and he makes this really interesting statement. And I kind of interpreted this, and I want to get your feedback on this, especially if you've seen the show. See if you kind of read this the same way that I did. So they cut to Robert Plant and he's talking about all the critics and the things that were going on, and the fact that they're playing these shows where they're getting big response. I mean, they're getting so much great response as they're touring across the United States. Everything's going super, super well. And then they get this really negative, a lot of these negative reviews, and especially the one from Rolling Stone, which is kind of like a big magazine. It had been out for a couple of years at that point, and a lot of people look to that magazine as kind of a cultural touchstone, right? So anyway, so here's Robert Plant. This is what he had to say. It was so interesting. So they cut to him and he's sitting there and he says, "Do you really care about other people's responses if you're playing like that?" Well, the answer is, unfortunately, yeah. But then he says that, and then he goes on, and he says that's where you can come unstuck, and that basically the idea is that's when things start falling apart. Whether it's the group or the music or even just your confidence in what you're doing. But then he goes on, and this is the part that I thought was really interesting, and I kind of tried to interpret this, what he was trying to say. And this is the part that, like I said, when I was taking notes, I grabbed this thing, and it said, "Fortunately, as four guys, we did not care that much." And it was almost as if he's saying, on an individual level, do you care what people have to say about this stuff? And he says, unfortunately, yeah. But the four of us together knew what we were doing. And we knew, he even went on and says, what we really cared about is how we impacted each other. That they were this team. And that ultimately is what was really important to him. Anyway, so that's how I interpreted that, and I thought that was pretty interesting. Again, that they would respond to the critical reviews like that. Okay, I got a few more. These are pretty fun. These are the moments again that kind of jumped out to me, because most of this documentary, like I said, is just them talking. It's not other people. It's them telling their own story. So it was these little quotes then that jumped out to me. So Robert Plant, they start talking about, now we're working on Led Zeppelin II. And of course, Led Zeppelin II when they recorded that, it wasn't like they did with one. It was Led Zeppelin II. They actually recorded while they were on tour in the United States. So they had the tapes with them, and they would just do it in various locations. Well, Robert Plant was talking about something, and this is so important because several times in the documentary, again, talking about this team element of what was happening with these guys. There's one point where John Paul Jones is talking about John Bonham, and he's talking a little bit about John Bonham's. He says, I loved Bonham's right foot. And the point was, because that's, a rhythm section of a band, you got your bass guitar and that kick drum and locking those two things in. And he kind of went into detail about this. You got to hear him talk about it. Like I said, you got to go see this because he as he's reminiscing and talking about what it was like in those moments. But so but he said that playing along with John Bonham, he didn't want to just boom, 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 just put some random, really simple, nondescript bass line to it. It was almost like John Bonham's playing inspired him in such a way that it actually made him step up his game a little bit. That was kind of the way it came across. And then Jimmy Page talked a little bit about this too, where he was trying to create the kind of music that would inspire Robert Plant to write the kind of lyrics that they needed. Because of course, Jimmy Page did some of the lyrics on Led Zeppelin 1. He talks a little bit about that. And then, so this is what happened. So Robert Plant, this is what he said. He says, my songwriting capacity is starting to kick in. He's talking about, again, right as they're working on Zeppelin II. And this is what he said. Because of the color of the playing that surrounded me. That is almost t-shirt worthy, in my opinion, because there's such an important philosophy in that idea. Being inspired by the things that are going on around you. And what ends up happening in those moments, especially with a band like this, is that everybody's excellence causes everybody else to step up their game, and then the excellence grows. And I'd be interested, especially because I know a lot of the people that watch this channel are musicians. Does that resonate with you? Do you know what I'm talking about? You find yourself in the right band with the right group of people, and that's exactly what happens. You find yourself in a group of people that you kind of see as all better than you, or people that are really, really good, and what does that do to you? It makes you step up your game. You play better. And it's like anything else. You want to become a good basketball player, make sure that you're the worst one on the team, and you'll be great eventually. And this was kind of the idea here where all these guys are building up each other. And here's Robert Plant saying, he was just kind of, he talked a little bit about how songwriting, there was this kind of vulnerability that comes with that. Being a songwriter and putting something that's kind of from your soul out there for the world to look at. And so he says here, that it was starting to kick in, and he says, but it was the playing. It was as he says there, the color of the playing that surrounded me, and that's what inspired him. And I think he was a great lyricist. And you look at this and you realize that so much of that was because he was surrounded by so much greatness. And each one of these guys, then you kind of catch that as you're watching this, again, this whole idea of becoming Led Zeppelin, that was a big part of it. That you had these four guys that in some ways were all inspiring each other. Okay, a couple more of these. These were so much fun. I loved this so much, hearing all these little things and putting these pieces together. So then Jimmy Page talks a little bit about this whole idea of when they recorded Led Zeppelin II, the fact that they did it while they were on tour. And Jimmy Page talks a little bit about why they did that, what the idea was behind it. And he said the idea was inspired by, and this is basically what he said, it was the love of people and getting the reaction of the audience. And then he goes on, and this is the part that I got down, and I love this statement. You've got the energy of being on the road, and you're actually documenting it within whatever you're recording. You've got the energy of being on the road, and you're actually documenting it within whatever you're recording. And, I did a show, I think was it yesterday? Yeah, on Led Zeppelin II. And I kind of talked through some of those songs, and I was getting a little nostalgic about them, admittedly. And it was so interesting listening to that idea behind it, that he made this comment that we were just out there. We wanted to capture the energy, what that felt like being on the road and being in all these different locations and bringing that into the studio. And looking back at that album, Led Zeppelin II, boy, just front to back, it's so interesting now listening to that and thinking about that's what they were doing and how well that they actually captured that in some ways, part of the magic of that album is probably just that it's these guys that are probably tired, they're on the road, going into studios, or they're playing these live shows and they're going in and recording. And then there's just the energy that comes along with it and probably running on fumes in some cases. And they talk in the documentary about now we're just in some, and they even said they didn't have, these great tour buses and all this other stuff. They're basically like, how do we get from town to town, riding commercial flights and cars and whatever they can, because it was just a different world back then. So you imagine these guys are just exhausted all the time, and yet they're bringing that excitement, that enthusiasm, that energy, all that stuff into the studio and putting it on tape. And it's almost like that flies off the tape now when we listen to it, that feeling, that energy. Anyway, that's what he talked about. That was the idea, capturing the energy of being on the road. Okay, let's see here. So we're getting close to the end of these little notes, but again, I love when you go see this yourself, because I know most people watching this probably will at some point. Love to get you to come back and share with me your thoughts, share your thoughts with me on these things. And if you've seen it already, you'll probably remember some of these. What did you think when you heard these little things, when these little moments happened in the show? So let's see here. Oh, this was so cool. So one of the things Jimmy Page said, because of course Jimmy Page produced all this stuff, and he said that was the important thing for me, that everybody could be heard what they were doing on a Zeppelin record. So he's talking a little bit about, I think at the time he was talking about the song Ramble On. I'm not 100% sure. I think that's the one that they were going through. By the way, they played that in the documentary, and it reminded me of how unbelievable that song is. Every time I hear that, I'm taken back to my 13 or 14-year-old self hearing that for the first time. And just the power of that song, how it saw the softness of it. Leaves are falling all around, time I was on my way. And then, then all of a sudden, ramble on. It's so great. It's so great. But when you listen to the production on Led Zeppelin II, listen to that song specifically, because each part is so clear. Of course, you have Jimmy Page strumming the guitar right there. You've got the little rhythm going on with John Bonham, which are both kind of sitting in their own space in sound. You have Robert Plant's voice, which is sitting right on top of it so perfectly. And then one of the things that that is so powerful in that song, Ramble On, is that bass line in the verses. Bum, 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 ba-na-na-na-na. Oh my gosh. It just has this, as Robert Plant's talking about this whole idea of moving on and leaves are falling, that little bass line has that feeling of heading down the road. And it's so perfect. And getting back to this whole point here, all the instruments have their space. And this is one of the things that good engineers and producers that don't know what they're doing often screw up, is they don't give the sound, each instrument, its own space, its own frequency range, its own location in space, from a left-right standpoint, whatever. They don't, and it ends up just getting muddy. And hearing Jimmy Page just make that statement, that was the important thing for me, that everybody could be heard what they were doing on a Zeppelin record. And then you just kind of go down the line and you start thinking about all the stuff Zeppelin put out over the years. And you understand that he's doing that he's going out of his way to make sure that each one of these instruments, whatever's in there, has its little place. And it doesn't have, like so many bands and producers and engineers that don't really have the experience that he did, that it didn't have that kind of cluttered, muddy sound that so much stuff does. And it was such a great thing. And again, it's this whole idea of these four guys coming together and then each one of them shining. Each one of them having their thing. And especially you look at Led Zeppelin II, and you even have Moby Dick. You know, you've got, because they even went out of their way to give John Bonham space to shine just on his own. So anyway, that was such a cool little thing to listen to. All right, so I've got a couple more of these, and then we'll wrap this up. But again, I hope, I'd love, again, so many people I know have already seen this because people have messaged me about it. Love to get your feedback on this. And when you do see this, if you haven't seen it yet, come back and give me your feedback on these things when you remember hearing them talking about this and what your thoughts are. That space thing right there. I mean, think of what other songs Led Zeppelin put out that you can think of where they really where he really succeeded with that. Okay. Oh man. Okay. This might have been my favorite thing that was said in the entire documentary. And this was John Paul Jones. Okay, I loved this. This was so powerful. And if you're a Led Zeppelin fan, this is such a great quote. This is so beautiful. So he basically, John Paul Jones was talking about the recording process. And again, they're working on Led Zeppelin II and creating this music. And he says basically they recorded what they liked. And he said Led Zeppelin had always had completely different influences. We all listened to different things. And then this is the part that I wanted to share with you. But I always said that Led Zeppelin was the area in the middle between us all. So here's John Paul Jones talking about all the different influences they had. And when you look at each one of their lives, because this is, again, the idea of this documentary, what is it that created them? What made this? And you look at these guys, yeah, they all had some similar things that they came from, but they all also had their own world that they brought in to this little group of this little team. And he goes, I always said Led Zeppelin was the area in the middle between us all. With all of us coming in here with all of our different influences, all the different backgrounds, all the stuff we brought to the table, Led Zeppelin existed in that space between us. Oh my gosh. I was like, I got t-shirt. That needs to be on a t-shirt. It was such a great statement. Led Zeppelin was the area in the middle between us all. Maybe he'd said that at some other point in the past and I just had missed it. But hearing that in the documentary was so powerful in the Becoming Led Zeppelin thing. Okay. Let's see here. Robert Plant made some comment about, they're talking again about Ramble On. He actually said that Ramble On was, those lines, leaves are falling all around, time I was on my way, that was the story of his life. And he kind of talked a little bit about his upbringing some more and how his parents, when he was growing up, would take him to all the really amazing places around England. You know, all the historic locations, the castles and things like this. And then he made this little comment that I thought was so powerful. And I think it's something for all of us just to remember in life. And maybe especially for those of us that are that are now a little bit older, kids, grandkids, the whole thing. And even though he was saying this as a 20-year-old kid, it's such an important part in life. And I wanted to share this with you. This is Robert Plant said, I just like the idea of the stimulus of travel and adventure. What do you know if you don't seek? So much of staying young, so much of growing, so much of staying fresh, it's this idea of adventure and seeking things and changing and learning and growing and developing. And he was, he's tying it to travel and adventure, but it's just a bigger picture than that. I like the idea of the stimulus of travel and adventure. And then he says, what do you know if you don't seek? Anyway, I thought that was such a great little quote. And then he goes on and says, you've got to go out and have a look for it. Awesome. All right. So almost done. Let's see here. So this is Robert Plant again talking about Led Zeppelin II. And so listen to this. If you're familiar with Led Zeppelin II, and if you've made it this far in the video, I'm guessing you're very familiar with Led Zeppelin II. And if you've managed to just sit here and listen to me jabber and ramble about this stuff. But see if this resonates with you. So he's talking about the process of recording Led Zeppelin II and the whole tour and the whole experience. Again, as I said a minute ago, they're playing all the time. And then in the middle of it, they're traveling and they're trying to figure out how to get from here to there and getting lost and then getting into a studio and recording and just on and on, just always going. And this is what he said. Let's see. He says, we recorded the songs for Led Zeppelin II on that tour. And then this is how he put it. It was like a kind of hurricane, a whirlwind of energy and release. And he, of course, being from Britain, he doesn't say hurricane, he says hurricane. And those of you that are from southern Utah, down in the area that we live, we have a town close by called Hurricane, but you don't say hurricane, you say hurricane, because British people are the ones that originally started it. Different, okay, that's a whole nother story. But listen to that again. It was kind of like a hurricane, a whirlwind of energy and release. And is there a better way to describe what they ended up getting from Led Zeppelin II? A whirlwind of energy and release. Man, great stuff. Okay, two more. And this, okay, so of course, John Bonham's not with us anymore. So of course, everything I'm quoting here is mainly those other three guys. And what they did in the documentary is they had a few, they didn't have very many, but they have a couple of recordings of Bonham talking. And there was one thing that jumped out at me. And again, because it gets back to this whole thing where they were a team. And so they're playing just this archival audio recording. And it's kind of, it's kind of touching in a couple spots because they actually show the guys listening to him talking. And I don't know if they've listened to him recently or whatever, but you can see Jimmy Page has this huge smile on his face while they're playing this John Bonham stuff. And okay. But this is John Bonham, and this is an old recording, obviously, of him talking about these early days. I thought this was so interesting. It was the middle of '69 before I really got to know each of them. It's a gradual thing, isn't it? And the reason that stuck out to me was it's like so many other things when you have strong relationships, they just take time. And when you get a band like this, like I said earlier on, that gets to that point in 1980 where John Bonham dies and they just say, we can't, that's it, we're done, because we obviously can't go on without John Bonham because it's the four of us. That he brings up that fact that it took time for them to like he said, it was in the middle of '69 before I really got to know each of them. So I mean, they've been together for almost a year before he feels like he's really getting to know him. But you imagine that going through, as Robert Plant said a second ago, the whirlwind, these guys are basically going to battle with each other. They're the ones on the stage that they're afraid nobody's going to show up, and so we're going to huddle together and just play for each other. These are the guys that are inspiring each other, and as he says there, it's a gradual thing, and then they became this team. Anyway, there weren't a lot of things from Bonham, but that was, when I heard that, I thought that was really good. Okay, here's the last one. And this one, I'm going to have to paraphrase some of this stuff because I'm writing this down as fast as I can, what was being said. But this was near the end of the documentary. And Jimmy Page kind of has this little, kind of this moment of inspiration where it's kind of puts the whole thing in a nutshell. This thing you've been watching for the last couple of hours, he wraps it up with this neat little bow. It's so great. And he said, if you have something that you know is different in yourself, then you have to put work into it. And then he says you have to work and work and work on whatever that thing is, this different thing in yourself. And then he also says, and you have to believe in it. And then here's the part. But as long as you can stay really true, your aim is true, you can realize your dreams. And then here's why this was so powerful. I do believe that. I believe that can be done because this is what happened. Here he was, recognized something in himself, a talent that he had. He put this band together and he worked and worked and worked all those years working in recording studios, practicing, learning, all the other things, and all the other guys in the band doing the same thing. And then putting this band together and the work and the work and the work, so much energy, so much time, all of that into it. And he says, if you do that, your dreams will actually can actually be realized. And how do I know that? Because that's the story of Led Zeppelin. So like I said, that was kind of a nice little bow to wrap up the documentary, what they'd put on together. And of course, there's 1,000 things in there that I didn't tell you, that I haven't talked about. But those were the moments for me that really kind of helped tell the story of becoming Led Zeppelin, of what this documentary was all about. And I highly encourage you, go see it. And if you've already seen it, I'd love to get your feedback on, did similar things jump out for you? And what did you think of these things that I brought up, if these were the similar things, or what was something else that jumped out for you? And if you do go see it, this will give you kind of a framework of things to look for, kind of an organization as you, and see if you can notice when these things pop up, and then come back to the video and give me your feedback. Share some of your thoughts on this, and then we'll. We've got so many things that we're planning on doing, and maybe what we'll do is try to make a video at some point, going through some of the feedback that we get and what other people's thoughts were on this documentary, because it's such a cool thing to listen to these guys talking about it, to reminisce a little bit, to see all that footage, and not just see the footage, because you can go watch a lot of Zeppelin footage on YouTube right now, whatever. But going into a theater, seeing it on the big screen, and having it be organized by a documentarian, so that you have the story laid out for you, and they take you on this little journey through the development of this band, and then to watch that. The culmination of it, and to see, hearing it in the background and watching the footage that they have and how they organize it, and then the sound, of the whole thing. It's so great. And there was so many moments in there where I'm hearing this thing and I go, man, it was just so great. The music was just so great. And to have something so spectacular happen the way it did with these people at this time, that all these things came together at the right moment to create this band that made this magic. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed that. Please follow the channel if you're not already following it. I'd love to get your feedback. Like we said, please like the video, obviously, too. And you probably, if you liked this video and you like talking about these things, I'm guessing you probably know other people that do too. And so I ask you, please share this with other people. Copy the URL out of YouTube and go paste it in Facebook if you have a Facebook account, or Twitter, or whatever, and share it with other people, because that'll help the channel grow. And we're trying to create things that help us all kind of remember, keep these things alive, and remember these experiences that we had when we were young, and the things that we all share together. And that's the kind of stuff that we're creating here. And we hope you enjoy it. So we'd love it if you'd share it with other people, so that the channel can continue to grow. And with that, have yourself a fantastic day.